The
honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to participate in the debate on the budget. I'm sure it'll come as no surprise to members in the chamber that I have a lot to say on the subject, and it is an interesting budget indeed. Lest I be accused of bringing the lead, I want to start by saying I think the most important element of the budget is the new dental care plan. This is the first major expansion of Medicare in over 50 years since Tommy Douglas first introduced Medicare and took it across the country, getting it passed here in Ottawa as well. It's something that Canadians have been waiting generations for now, and it's going to make a really big difference in the lives of, first of all, children 12 and under who should have access to basic dental care services this year, and then expanding to children 18 years and under, seniors, people living with disabilities next year, and a full implementation of the program so that all Canadian households with a household income of $90,000 or less should have access to basic dental care by 2025. That's a big deal, and it's going to make a difference for a lot of people. And so that's why I wanted to start off by just reminding folks. I think, sometimes in the media commentary around the budget, journalists and others have been quick to move on from that point. You've got dental care NDP, but what have you done for us lately? Well, this is just in the budget. It is new, and as it rolls out, I think Canadians are going to see and appreciate what a massive difference it can make for so many of our friends and neighbors and people that live in our communities. And I think just like Medicare in its day, once Canadians see how this works, and so many people experience the benefit and see people they know benefit from the program, it's something Canadians are going to be very proud to say is part and parcel of being Canadian, that having a right to dental service is part and parcel of being Canadian, and I believe strongly it's something Canadians will not want to give up. So for me, that's the real big news in this budget, and it's the overwhelming reason why New Democrats are proud to support it. It's why we undertook to negotiate with the government to get something out of this Parliament that Canadians elected just 6 months ago. And so having spoken a little bit about dental care now, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk a little bit about the state of politics and what's been happening in this place, but also what's been happening outside of this place, and why New Democrats felt it was important to try and take a constructive approach to this Parliament to deliver real results for people that are going to make a difference in their life. And I don't think it's news to anyone in this chamber who are all involved in politics in one way, shape, or form to a very high degree, that the nature of political discourse has been getting really nasty, nastier and nastier over the course of many years now, even before the pandemic. And there are no shortage of things to be angry about in a time of rising inflation and uncertainty and the challenges of the pandemic. So it's appropriate for people to feel concern, to feel anxiety, and to feel anger at the changes that are happening around them and the impacts that it's having on them in their life. But as elected people, as public officials, as leaders in our community, we have a choice to make. We can double down on that strategy of polarization and anger and division and try and wedge and get as much political benefit as we can by going to people in their anger and ramping it up and trying to take advantage of that to elect more of whoever people see as the best flag bearer of that anger. Or we can recognize that things have been getting worse as our politics have gotten more polarized. That for as much as gratifying that anger can be satisfying, and there's an important element in politics of giving expression to people's legitimate frustration, it hasn't been getting to solutions. It hasn't actually been heading off the real problems that are the source of that anxiety and anger. And so we're called to try and do something different instead of doing the same old thing. And we know in the NDP, if people want to double down on that strategy of anger and polarization, there's no shortage of places they can go for people who are going to encourage that. But if they want to see their politicians get down to work and recognize that there are real differences between, for instance, the NDP and the Liberals, just as there are real differences between the NDP and the Conservatives. And perhaps there are less differences than we're sometimes led to believe between the Liberals and the Conservatives, but they certainly like to ramp up the contrast on what differences are there. I think Canadians do want to see us get down to work. They do want to see us move forward on constructive proposals. And that message was very clear in the last election when Canadians elected a parliament that looks very much like the one before, after telling us in no uncertain terms that they didn't want an election. And in fact, in the lead up to the last election, just in the June before we recessed for the summer that turned into the election that no one wanted, every opposition party in this place pledged not to cause an election, because they recognized that that isn't what Canadians wanted, and they recognized that it wasn't going to be the solution to our problem. So when we came back here after the election, we asked ourselves how we could try to do politics differently, not to disregard the important differences between us and other parties in the chamber, but how we could work collaboratively. The first instance of successful collaboration for me in this parliament was when I worked with members of the Conservative Party and the Bloc Québécois at the Finance Committee to pass an amendment on the new pandemic benefit program that the government had introduced to make sure that, unlike in the first iteration, in the new program, companies that were accepting wage subsidy money wouldn't be able to pay dividends to their shareholders, because we agreed that was something that was important to do. And that was an example already of New Democrats being willing to work with people in other parties in order to get things done that would matter for Canadians. And of course, in recent weeks, we managed to reach an agreement with the government to make sure that certain priorities that we fought for and we believe are important and that we think will serve Canadians well would be represented in the budget. We're going to continue to work under the framework of that agreement to deliver on more. But there has been the beginning of delivering of those priorities in this agreement, Mr. Speaker. So I want to talk a little bit more about what some of those items are. And I want to start by talking about revenue, because it is a big part of the conversation about how the federal government gets on a good fiscal track. And our contention here, and it's why we opposed a Conservative Opposition Day motion that called for no new taxes at all, is that revenue has to be part of that conversation, and that there is no credible path to balance without talking about the revenue side of the equation. And that's why there was work done in the agreement between us and the government on moving on revenue. And so there was a few measures actually, but I'm going to talk specifically about the permanent increase on the corporate tax rate for banks and insurance companies of 1.5%. And then in addition to that, there was a pandemic dividend, another tax on banks and insurance companies, a one-time tax of 15 extra percent. Now that sounds like a lot. You have to bear in mind, Mr. Speaker, that's 15 extra percent on their earnings over $1 billion. So this isn't something that's about going after all of the mom and pop businesses that struggled in the pandemic, that needed help and are still trying to get back on their feet. This is about giant companies that did very well, thank you, during the pandemic, who should be pitching in to help pay for the ongoing support that's needed to get Canadians the rest of the way through this pandemic and to start getting serious about tackling the climate crisis, something that unfortunately this budget doesn't do, and I'm going to come back to that in my remarks, Mr. Speaker. So we got started on revenue, but we were just talking in question period today about the fact that 2 reports came out this week showing that a number of other giant companies in other industries have made record profits. Cargill alone in 2021 made $5 billion in net income, which is over half again what it had made in 2020. That's a giant increase. And it's an increase that goes well above and beyond what their rising costs are. Or it wouldn't be an increase in net revenue, it would be an increase in gross revenue. So what we know is that a lot of companies are using this time of economic uncertainty to raise their prices much higher than their costs are going up, and that's why we believe the government hasn't gone far enough in this budget. That pandemic dividend should be applied to many more companies that have made much more money in the pandemic as a result of the pandemic, and the permission it appears to have given them to raise prices, permission that they shouldn't feel is legitimate, and that there's a way to stop that or to curtail it, which is by taxing that extra profit and reinvesting it in the things we need. So that's a little bit on the revenue front. And I could go on. We've talked about having a wealth tax on fortunes of $10 million and greater. We've talked about serious action on tax havens, which we don't see here. After successive Liberal and Conservative governments have made cozy tax arrangements with tax haven nations, we know that Canada is losing about $25 billion a year in revenue, and that's revenue that would well be spent here at home if only our governments would stop allowing the wealthiest among us and the biggest companies to shelter their wealth from those legitimate taxes. But this budget also brings measures the NDP fought for that are about value for money. Dental care is about value for money because we know that when you don't get access to preventative oral care, it creates health problems that cost more to fix later once they've gotten worse than if you can nip it in the bud. And that's despite all the other benefits for people's quality of life to have access to timely preventative oral health care. Value for money comes from the initiative on housing, and particularly the change in definition under the National Housing Strategy of what counts as affordable. So, for instance, Mr. Speaker, prior to this budget and prior to the agreement with the NDP, the definition of affordable housing was 30% of the median household income in an area. So what that means is that in many cases, affordable units, so-called affordable units, could actually be rented out at higher than the market rate. And I'll give you some examples, for instance. In Edmonton, where the average market rent was $1,180 a month, under the affordable definition of the Liberals' National Housing Plan, you could charge up to $2,627 a month. Well, we got the definition changed so that it's no longer about the income of the people that you happen to live next to, but that it's actually about having units rented at below market rate, 80% of market rate. So that means that in Edmonton, that unit that public dollars were helping build that could be rented out at over $2,500 a month, under the new definition would have to be rented out at $944 a month. That's just one example, and there are comparable examples for many different markets across the country. That's about getting better value for public money, because you can announce as much money as you want to build new housing. If you're contributing to new housing under the pretext of making new affordable units, and those units are rented out above market rate, we're never going to get out of the hole we're in, and we're not going to create affordable housing for Canadians. And New Democrats care very much to ensure that when public dollars are spent, we're getting value for that money. We weren't getting it under the National Housing Strategy, and we are now going to get it because of this important change of definition, which doesn't cost Canadians an extra dime, but it's going to get a hell of a lot more value out of the money that they are spending on housing, Mr. Speaker. The Rapid Housing Initiative, we heard earlier about the importance of social housing beyond simply affordable housing. The Rapid Housing Initiative is the only program under the National Housing Strategy that delivers any social housing units. No question, we need to do more, but that's why it was a priority for the NDP to see a year's extension of the National Housing Initiative, or that, of the Rapid Housing Initiative, because it's under that program that we're seeing some social housing units built. No question we need to do more, but again, that's how we get value for money. And I would add, Mr. Speaker, we see reference again to pharmacare in the budget. Very glad, because the reference to pharmacare in the Liberal platform was dropped altogether in 2021. And that reference to pharmacare wouldn't be in the budget but for the NDP's negotiation, using the leverage of our 25 seats in this place to get the government to do the right thing that it said it would do. And that is about value for money as well as better service for Canadians. Because a national pharmacare plan, while it will cost $20 billion on federal books, is less than the $24 billion that Canadians currently spend on prescription drugs through various provincial and territorial programs, through individual payments, through company benefit plans, and the premiums that they pay on those plans. So, pharmacare is a way to get better value for the money that Canadians already spend on prescription drugs and actually lower the overall cost by $4 billion. So the NDP is very much concerned about how we have good books, but not at the expense of individual Canadian households. We're not here to talk about how we take the real deficit, that is a deficit in services and the ability of Canadians to pay for the things they need off the public books and transfer it onto individual Canadians and say sink or swim on your own, particularly when so many are close to drowning financially after all the effects of the pandemic. We're here to say, how do we pay for these things together? How do we raise the revenue we need to pay for them? How do we get the value for money that we need to do so that we're not paying more than we should for the things we need? And that's what we're here to talk about, Mr. Speaker. So, I do want to spend a little bit of time, and I know my time is running out. It's too bad. I have many more things to say. But I do want to talk about some of the deficiencies of this budget. And I want to zone in particularly on climate. Because the fact of the matter is that we don't have a lot of time to act. We don't have a lot of time to get it right. And for decades now, Canada has been running a bet on the fossil fuel industry. We've been doing it in terms of revenue for government, hoping that it works out. We've been doing it on the climate, hoping that it works out. And we have been losing at that bet. We've been losing on the climate side for sure. And to the extent that eventually the floor is going to fall through on that bet, we haven't been doing what we need to make sure that we've diversified our economy for the sake of workers who are going to feel it when the fossil fuel industry is not what it once was. And we've already experienced some periods of that recently. And we've also been failing to diversify the sources of government revenue that will also have to be made up when the fossil fuel sector is not the same cash cow for governments that it's been. And the problem with this budget is that it doubles down on the bet, hoping that carbon capture and storage is going to allow for the fossil fuel industry to continue. We saw that not only in the budget, but also in the recent approval of the Bay-du-Nord project. So the government continues to hope that some new technology, as yet unproven at scale, is going to reduce emissions for fossil fuels adequately enough that we can pretend like the fossil fuel industry is not the problem that it is in respect of the climate crisis. That's not the approach we need. We can't continue to double down on the bet. We have to change track, and we have to start diversifying. That means investing in renewable energy. You know, there's a proposal out there for a Western Regional Power Grid, for instance, Mr. Speaker. That is a major nation-building infrastructure project that can put people to work who have a lot of transposable skills from the oil sands to build something that's going to be of massive benefit to the country, that can generate massive revenue for the country, and actually displace fossil fuel as one of the sources of electricity generation in Canada. That's a good thing. That's the kind of project. And I raise that just as one example of the kind of innovative, big thinking projects that could go a long way to changing Canada's emission profile. But instead, what we see is 2.9 or thereabouts $billion for carbon sequestration, carbon capture and sequestration to give back to oil companies that currently are making a lot of money with high oil prices. So that is a miss. And of course, we know that when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we heard this earlier in question period, we need to see action, Mr. Speaker. It's been years now since that report was released, and Indigenous women and girls are still the object of violence. They're still disappearing, they're still being killed, their families are still grieving. And the bureaucratic kind of inertia of this place is not an excuse to deprive those families of justice or an excuse not to protect Indigenous women and girls who are currently in danger just by virtue of living in our communities. That's completely unacceptable. We need to find a path forward. I know that the member from Winnipeg Centre has been doing excellent work, pushing the minister in this government to get action. We look forward to supporting that work as best we can and seeing a much more definitive plan for how we make immediate progress as we move forward, Mr. Speaker. So thank you for letting me share some thoughts about the budget. I look forward to questions and comments.
Questions et commentaires de façon...
Questions and comments virtually. The Honourable Member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This budget has been described as modern supply-side economics. Now, the traditional supply-side economics, as brought forward by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, went for deregulation, big tax cuts for big business so that it would expand. And it worked, except it worked in Asia and not in North America, and we lost a lot of good middle-class jobs. Whereas, according to Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, modern supply-side economics prioritizes labor supply, human capital, public infrastructure, research and development, and investments in a sustainable environment. And I'd like the honourable member's comments on that if he sees this budget in the same light.
L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I think I would be more inclined to see it in that light. First, if we recognize that Indigenous people are a large and growing segment of the Canadian population, particularly in Manitoba, where I'm from, and that we need to invest in Indigenous people. We need to make sure that they have the housing they need so that they're not concerned about overcrowding where they live or mold in their home while they're trying to get an education so that they can participate in the labor market. I'd be more inclined to feel that way about the budget if it gave a meaningful timeline for employment insurance reform, which is a really important part of helping workers navigate a difficult labor market at the moment, despite the fact that there are a lot of jobs available. It doesn't mean that every worker is the right match for the job that's available. So we need to do more on that. I was remiss in not mentioning a Canada Disability Benefit, and I hope I'm going to get a question on that so that we can talk a little bit more about that, Mr. Speaker. But certainly when we talk about a kind of limited supply-side economics focusing on workers, I do think there's a lot more focus we need to put on workers for this budget to earn that title.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Simcoe North.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague for his intervention and his comments, especially as they relate to greater cooperation in this House and the tone that we take. I think that's very important. I would like to mention that I have enjoyed working well with my colleague on the Finance Committee. As he referenced, we did make an amendment to government legislation. I hope I can look forward to some potential cooperation in the future with respect to legislation as well. But with respect to the budget, Mr. Speaker, the question I have for this member is the government has put forward, in part of its housing strategy, a marquee new account for young people to save for a home. I wonder if he could let this House know what his thoughts are on the housing strategy in general, but in particular this marquee savings account that this government will be touting all across the country.
L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to get such a thoughtful question on housing policy. And I think that the issue that I have with that and that I'm concerned about is that in the absence of aggressive initiative by the government to address the financialization of housing, efforts like this to make a little bit more cash available to first-time home buyers are just going to get eaten up in the bidding process. So for as much as, if we had a relatively stable housing market without the kind of year-over-year price increases that we've seen, this kind of thing might be helpful. But in a context where bidding wars continue to drive up the price year over year in incredible ways, my concern is that this is simply going to contribute to higher bids on houses. The winners there are developers and real estate agents, not the home buyers. And so that's why we need to see the government take action like, for instance, what they've done in New Zealand, where they have an incrementally higher down payment for every subsequent property. We need to cool the investment activity before a policy like this could really make the difference I think all members would want to see it make.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member from Elmwood-Transcona for his comments. I would agree that a significant piece with this budget is the National Dental Care Plan. This is essential, I think, for all of our health, and it is one step towards completing Tommy Douglas's dream from 60 years ago. And I know my seniors in my community would welcome it. And starting this year, children will begin to get dental services. So that's a key piece to which 25 New Democrats were able to leverage our power to bring such services to Canadians. Now, with that being said, he also commented on a variety of other issues. I know that the people in Vancouver East are particularly concerned about the lack of action on the climate emergency. In British Columbia, we have experienced extreme weather from wildfires to floods and so on. So I'd like to ask the member to elaborate on this piece, on the shortcomings with the budget, as well for people who are faced with disabilities in our community. I'd like to hear his comments around what the government needs to be taking action on to address that.
L'honorable député Delmo.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Very much for that question. And I really think on the question of the Canada Disability Benefit that the Liberals promised in the last Parliament and promised again in their platform, I was hoping to see something on that. You know, it wasn't an item that we appeared able to get into the agreement, but it's something that we really do need to move forward on quickly. And I think people living with disabilities across the country who have been legislated into poverty for far too long deserve to see swift action on this. I know that our disabilities critic has written the minister on this issue, calling for the introduction of legislation quickly, and I think that's important so that we can get the details right. I don't think that it should be a rushed job. And in respect of climate, as I was saying earlier, it's not. They're really not on the right track in this budget, and we need to be looking at how we diversify our energy sources into far more renewable energy. They were willing to spend tens of billions of dollars now on a pipeline. And then they turn around and say, well, public investment isn't the answer on renewable energy. We need private capital to step up and do that. And I can't for the life of me figure out why it's acceptable to spend almost $20 billion on a pipeline and then plead poverty when it comes time to investing in renewable energy.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Longueuil, Charlemagne. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a real pleasure to see you in the chair.
For his speech, and while I know we can agree on a lot of things that are in the budget, and I'm delighted because that's what Canadians want us to do. They want us to work together to do what's best for Canadians. So I'm delighted that we can find some common ground here in the budget 2022. But one area that he did not discuss in his speech that I'd like to get his opinion on is the additional $8 billion in defence spending on top of what we've already committed to with Strong, Secure, Engaged. As the member knows, I am the mother of 2 serving members and the mother-in-law of a serving member. So I have a joke on the Hill that they call me the force generator. Because so as the force generator here on the Hill, I'd like to get the member's opinion on the increase in defence spending, given the fact of what is happening in Europe right now, given the fact that we need to modernize NORAD, given the fact that we need to look at Strong, Secure, Engaged, because when we wrote it almost 5 years ago, a lot of things have changed. If you would like to elaborate. Thank you.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I think I talked a little bit earlier about the kind of polarizing nature of political debate, and I think in the last week or so, there's been a tendency to think that, you know, you're either on board with spending 2% of GDP, which would represent about $25 billion a year, every year going forward, on defense spending, or you're not in favor of any defense spending at all. I think that is a false dichotomy. And what New Democrats have always said is that our men and women in uniform need the equipment and the skills to do what they're asked to do. We saw them deployed during the pandemic to our long-term care facilities. We've seen them deployed domestically and internationally in response to natural disasters or humanitarian crises. These are things that they need the equipment to be able to do. And it's no secret to anyone that there has been an incredible inability by governments of both stripes to be able to procure new equipment for our defense forces. And so we do support some spending in order to get them the equipment that they need. We are very skeptical about 2% of GDP as the right amount. Clearly, we have priorities like dental care and pharmacare and other things that we think should take precedence over that much of an increase in defense spending. So we're not opposed to some increases in defense spending, but are adamant that 2% of GDP is more than we ought to be affording for defense spending at this time, given all the other pressing demands on the shoulders of Canadians.